everybody, this is Edwin the Magic Engineer, Deck Brewers Series Video 2, and this video is all about goldfishing, focusing on your deck list and doing some refining, and solo play, which is something I've probably never revealed before, but I actually do when I'm testing. What's goldfishing? Goldfishing is a term that a lot of card gamers use. It's when you're not playing against anyone. You take just your deck by yourself, you shuffle it up, draw the cards, and you look at kind of how it's working as you draw cards, and maybe like kind of play out some of the turns with like an imaginary opponent next to you. And you just try to see how does the deck basically draw out to get some kind of feeling of the mana curve and how like the strategy of the deck unfolds and stuff like that. That's what goldfishing is. So I'll do a little bit of that. A couple quick notes before we start though. This is old school format I'm designing this deck for, but the lessons I'm trying to give in this I believe will translate to most other formats. Sometimes with the ratios being off, like a commander deck is of course, or EDH is 100 cards, these are 60 card decks. So the numbers I'm picking for like mana versus spells, those change a little bit. But the strategies are all still there and they're all still valid. They will actually translate. And this also of course goes to other formats. Like what I'm showing you here with this old school deck will translate to vintage and standard and modern and like all these other like metas and all these other like format types for Magic the Gathering. So also this deck is a mid-range deck. I mentioned this in the last video a little bit, but I'm not targeting the most expensive cards like the Power 9 and stuff like that in this deck. I'm actually targeting the mid-range cards. So it's not just monocolor, it's dual color, and therefore it has dual lands, and it has some mid-range expense cards. But I'm trying to stay away from anything that's like $500 and up, so no Nether Void, no The Abyss, things like that. But anyways, let's get right to it, and let's jump right into that goldfishing, and let's talk about what that actually is. Okay, so here we are, back with the deck. And what we're going to do right now, before I ever do any gold fishing, we need to pile shuffle. And the first thing we do when we pile shuffle is we need to get all the mana separated out, weave it back in, and that's what the pile shuffling does. But then you got to ruffle shuffle a bunch of times after that. So before I do that, you guys will notice that I still have these little Mox gems. Here's the pearl. This thing's really cool. I love these gems. They're so awesome. Figured they'd be nice eye candy for the video. Try to get up and out of the way there. And there's the Mox Jet. So much fun. I love these things. So I'll just get them up there. Okay, so now in order to mana weave properly, what we do is first we set out all the mana. Now notice I actually pulled out that Dark Ritual. That's a whole discussion unto itself. There's a question on whether or not you count things like Dark Ritual, Soul Ring, Moxes, other things like that as mana sources, or do you actually count them as spells? So the answer is that there are times where you count them as spells, and there are times where you count them as mana sources. And what it really comes down to most of the time is how playable they actually are. If you can actually set out a Soul Ring or play a Dark Ritual very easily on turn 1, and just based on the format, based on the environment, you're almost never questioning whether or not you can do that, then the answer is, yeah, you treat it as mana. But if you play against an environment, let's say people are going to play cards like Sphere of Resistance that makes everything more expensive, or they're going to play Trinisphere or something like that. Well, in that kind of environment, maybe Dark Ritual actually would not get considered to be an actual mana source, because you need a land to actually get it out. And when you're figuring out what your mana to spells ratio is, you now actually need to consider these ones as more expensive because they're going to be. But most of the time, if you have a lot of black sources in your deck, you're going to be able to get that Dark Ritual out so consistently that you can go right ahead and consider it to be a mana source, right? So anyways, I pulled out all the mana sources, and now the first thing I do in a pile shuffle is you make stacks of 8. And then I'm doing this face up so you guys can see. Let's get that out of the way. Stacks of 8. And then I just go through the whole thing, and then you're going to make stacks of 3. So normally I just go fairly quick with this. I'll speed up the camera starting now. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pick these all up, and any order doesn't matter. Now, again, normally these are all face down. I'm only doing it face up so you can see what this actually is. But I just pick them up in any order, doesn't really matter. But since I did all the mana first, and since I had 26 mana sources and 34 spells, what you'll see is like 3 mana sources, then a bunch of spells, 3 mana sources, bunch of spells, 3 mana sources, so they're all in big clumps like that. Now, that was stacks of 8. Now we're going to do stacks of 3. And so I'll speed up the camera again. Okay, now we pick up all the cards again. And again, I'm repeating to make sure it's very clear. Normally, these are all face down, and you're not seeing them. But just right now, we're doing it face up so you can see. So now what you'll notice is what you have when you go through it is like a mana source, some cards, mana source, cards. It's all fairly woven in. Every other like card is like either a mana source or a spell. So it's fairly distributed. So this is what you'll actually hear as mana weaving is what I just did. That's what just happened is mana weaving. So as this deck exists right now, it's not legal. It's not legitimate because you separated the mana and then you wove it all together in a very consistent pattern. So what you have to do to be a legal tournament ready deck is after you separate them out and then you pile shuffle them back in, now you just have to normal shuffle. And you can either do it like this, the drop-in method. This is what I normally do for sleeves. Take the bottom corner, because like all my sleeves are open on the top. So I take that bottom corner and I go into the side there, and then you just kind of relax, oops, what's in your hand. That one was terrible, wasn't it? Bottom corner to the side, relax your hand and shove them together. Just like that. Gotta go through that at least like several times. I remember hearing at one point it was like at least 3 times you have to pile shuffle. Also with sleeves, there's another way you can actually do it. I'll separate them like this and I'll bend them like this and do like a shuffle, a face down shuffle like this. See how good that actually worked? But you know, with my vintage cards, I don't do that very often because I'm not too keen on bending the cards, and so most of the time I'm just going to do this kind of method, especially because I use dragon shields, very tough sleeves. So there we go. There was the shuffle method. So then you hand your deck to your opponent. They do a cut. So you just go ahead and kind of go through that motion. Now remember, what we're going to do here is we are actually going to goldfish. Now the point of goldfishing is you want to see how does the deck draw? How does this work was you're just pulling the cards out. So you pull off the top 7 cards. Would this be a mulligan? Well, I would say yes, because we have tons of mana sources and not a lot of threats. The Spectre's pretty good, but he's not getting Dark Ritualed out, and then I'm going to mana flood basically here. So this one would probably be a mulligan. How would that have turned out? Oh, that was good. I mean, look at all that mana. See how, like, notice, I want to call this out. I mana weaved this deck. I mana weaved it. So technically speaking, this shouldn't have happened. This right here proves that the ruffle shuffling and the shuffling that I did actually did randomize it again. But anyways, we actually pay attention to that fact that I actually got a bunch of lands in my first draw. Because when you're goldfishing, one of the things you're looking for is to see, is my mana balance about right? So now, here's a good question. I could just draw 6, because what we're trying to do with this deck is kind of replicate, as we goldfish, what would it be like in an actual tournament. And there's value to that. I'm actually going to draw 7 though. And why? Because I want to get several starting hands of 7, because I want to see, after several times of getting starting hands, what do they actually look like. So this starting hand had 3 mana sources. I had the ability to cast white with the city. I had the ability to cast black. This was actually a pretty decent starting hand. So the first one flooded. The second one seemed pretty decent. Now I'm going to go ahead and goldfish this again. Before I do though, do you see how I separated the mana back out? Spaced them out there, there, and there? That's important because what we're trying to just quickly draw through this deck. We're going to goldfish it a bunch of times, and we want to see how does it work with several different starting hands. We want to get an idea in our head. what that actually looks like. So if you pull out a bunch of cards, you kind of want to separate them out again before you shove them back in. So here's the third one. Now we got the black that we needed, right? And that's good. We haven't seen a dark ritual yet, but we know we got 4 in there, so they should show up. If we had a dark ritual, we would have definitely had some things we could have played very early on. There was no white, and so now right here, you see there's a couple Urborgs there. The question is, these are legendary lands. If one of them comes out, you can't really do the other one without creating problems for yourself. So I effectively only really have 2 mana with this starting hand. Now I would start to question the sense of actually having 2 Urborgs in the actual deck, but at this point, but I actually, there's only 2 in the deck, and the chances that they're both going to come in the starting hand are honestly not huge chances. That shouldn't have even happened this time. So even though that started out as like a bad draw, I'm just going to consider that unlucky. So we've done 3 now. The first one flooded, second one was good, third one had a problem with multiple Urborgs. Notice how I'm keeping record. I'm paying attention to how these draws actually look. Say the opponent cuts it like that or something. Now we draw off the top ones again. Okay, again, we got enough black to do basic things like him. We had a good starting hit for something. We had nothing white to cast those white ones. Mind Twist wouldn't have been, this is more like a turn 3 or 4 kind of spell, and so is the disc. So not a great starting hand, but that hymn looks pretty good. How would the next few turns have looked? Okay, so by turn 4, we definitely would have been casting Swords and Disenchant, and we did hit some other lands for it. So that mana did seem to work out. But that would have been a little bit of a questionable keep for a starting hand. Oops, look at that. I'm throwing cards around. Maybe even we ruffle this a little bit. Okay, see how that looks. So look at that, that's a flood. Look at that. Now, something to consider, depending on who you're playing against, multiple strips at the beginning can be really good. Decks that actually don't play a lot of mana, if you know their deck is thin on mana, there's times where I might actually keep a hand like this, because if I strip their first 2 lands off the board and they never get started, then I still have mana to keep playing. There's decks where I know that I'll hammer them pretty badly, so even though this looks like a flood, I have the ability to plow an early creature. I have a couple blacks I'll need for hymns and things later. It's unfortunate that's such a late game creature. But some early strips with backup mana actually is not terribly bad. How would this have turned out afterwards? Okay, a Dark Ritual. Would have done much for that. So there would have been a little bit later aggro. So there would have been some strip mines, then probably playing an early creature, and then eventually maybe trying to drop an Armageddon or something like that would have probably been the strategy. Now let's separate these all back out. See again how I separate all those lands back out for doing the shuffling. You want to keep, I mean, you want your deck to be randomized, and shuffling does randomize it, but if you start in clumps, all it basically means is all your mana in clumps means you have to shuffle a lot to get it all spread back out again. So starting by kind of spacing it out, it honestly just saves you time. You just don't have to shuffle as much to basically get it randomized and kind of split up again. So how did this look? Okay, so we had white and the ability to swords a couple of their creatures off the board. We didn't have enough black to get a hymn off, but we did get a disenchant. So depending on what deck we play against, we do have 2 mana. We do have both the colors that we actually need, and we have some good defensive spells. So against the right deck, this would be a keeper hand. How did this play out later on? Another disenchant, a hymn we couldn't cast. There's another black. So 3 turns in before we could actually cast that first hymn. There's a second hymn. So that could be good against some decks, but would possibly be bad against others. Okay, so the point is now we've goldfished several times. We have an idea how the deck really draws out, right? So now we do, let's move on to another phase I want to call focus. So now we look at the deck and we think about what was actually there. How did it actually draw, right? Well, it did seem sometimes like the defensive spells came up early. I didn't have a lot of good early creatures. And you might wonder, like, I know there's creatures that are early creatures in there. Where were they all, right? And what about all the Dark Ritual Specters? Why didn't those ever come up? Well, we got 4 Dark Rituals. We got 4 Hypnotic Specters. They should have honestly come up more often. The hymns should have come up more often because there's 4 of them in there. We know the ratios are about right. We never even saw any Ur Graders in those like starting hands. So I think honestly what the data set shows me is there just isn't enough goldfishing to actually make a good call. Because we know cards should have come up more often, but they actually didn't. Now this whole goldfishing thing, I've done it 5 times, I think now if I'm counting right in my head. When I'm testing one of my own decks, I might literally goldfish through like 15, 20 different hands just to really eliminate the variable randomness that can happen when you're doing this stuff, right? There's another starting hand. So we finally hit a Dark Ritual, a land to cast it, and there's a Hypnotic Specter. That's a pretty solid start right there. It didn't leave us with a lot of other mana, but then there's a Strip Mine to back it up. And so I can get a hippie out very quickly, and then I can keep them from being able to play their stuff with that Strip Mine, making that Hypnotic Specter a lot more effective. And if I get any other, or I could keep that out and get an Ur Graders out before I use the strip and just have a lot to really pressure them. So that's not bad. That's not a bad starting hand. How does it play out? Disenchant, unusable, unusable. There we go. There's a Plains, a few other cards down. So that Ritual Hippie seemed pretty good, right? So basically, yeah, you goldfish through a few times, and then you go to that stage now you call focus. So when I'm focusing on the deck, I kind of like look through the deck and I think about how did it actually play out. And it did seem to have the actual pieces that it actually did need. But it did also seem like there wasn't honestly a lot of speed. And I know that based on playing a lot of old school, the Dark Rituals give speed. But you know what happens though when you get like a land to play it, and you get a Dark Ritual, and then your only thing you can cast is either an Ur Graders, or maybe a Hymn to Turak, or maybe an Order of the Ebon Hand, or something like that. I mean, you get all this fantastic speed, but I mean, you're going to be wasting a mana with like all these other plays you could possibly use, and that's definitely something to consider, right? And I start to see some of that in like goldfishing, so I notice that this is an actual issue. And so this is something, maybe at this phase, when I'm going through the focus phase, I might make my first actual substitutions here. And coming back over to the cards that I had in the deck beforehand, you know what I'm thinking? Look at these Stone Throwing Devils. And let's think about what this actually does. If you actually go land, Dark Ritual, you got that 3 mana. Any one of these 2 casting cost things that can happen next. Let's get these on the screen if we can. And let's also see, there's Black Knights are another one. Demonic Tutor is another one. Is that it? Oh, there's another Chaos Orb. That could come out very early. I would have an order. Okay. So if you're starting off with a land and a Dark Ritual, and we don't have Stone Throwing Devils, look at all of these 2-drop spells. There's a couple of these, 4 of those, a few of those, like 3 of those, 1 of that, and 1 of that. We have an awful lot of 2-drop stuff, but no other 1-drop to fill that last mana coming in from Dark Ritual. Well, look what this does, though. If I have Stone Throwing Devils in the deck, I can now actually play like a Black Knight and a Stone Throwing Devils, or a Chaos Orb and a Stone Throwing Devils, or like any one of these and one of these guys. Also on turn 1, if I don't draw a Dark Ritual, I actually at least have a Stone Throwing Devils that I can get out. So with 4 Dark Rituals and 4 Stone Throwing Devils, I actually make my turn 1 a little bit better, because I now have 8 cards in the deck that I can actually get that'll give me a turn 1 play, right? So goldfishing this out, I'm looking at these guys thinking they actually need to go in. Now, there's another thing that I noticed. I'm going to put these aside for a second. When, let's say I did lots of goldfishing, and I played out a few turns, because you saw me just basically shuffling like this, drawing and looking at my starting hands. But what you can actually do when you're goldfishing is you can just go through the actual turns. Say there's my turn 1 play, pass turn, second turn, come through, play that. Okay, now I can do a Black Knight, turn 2, turn 3, untap, draw, play that out. I have access to 4 mana. I could actually, or 5 mana, I could Armageddon. Probably don't want to do that. I'd probably want to plow their creature, swing with the Black Knight, keep them on defense, go for a next turn. Maybe, if I knew I was going to Armageddon, by the way, I'd probably hold these back. If I thought my opponent has now played out a lot of his lands, I might actually tap those and Dark Ritual, then Geddon, so all these go away, and then start dropping lands again, right? Because he might have played out his lands. Swing, untap. If he had nothing out, I'd probably strip mine his land to keep that pressure on him, swing again. Otherwise, I'd probably get that out, so I had the ability to either disenchant or plow. So you kind of like go through and look at what... See, this is... You can do this with goldfishing. You can kind of draw through the deck and see how it actually works, right? Now, the reason why I'm talking about all that is many of you might have noticed, many of you mentioned even in the comments before, there was an issue with Nightmare, right? Nightmare's only good with swamps. And I have an awful lot of other cards in this deck that are not swamps that are hurting me, right? That's not a swamp. That's going to cause a problem. That's not a swamp. That's going to cause a problem. And that's not a swamp. That's going to cause a problem. I've got a lot of mana sources that are not swamps, and so therefore the Nightmares, I can get them out fast. But they're not necessarily going to be that big because an awful lot of my mana was non-swamps. Based on that, I probably, after goldfishing, would realize I need to make a swap in this deck. I probably need to take out the Nightmares and put in the Singer Vampires. So there's one Nightmare out. Let's go find the other one. There's the other one. Okay, so 2 Nightmares out, 2 Singer Vampires in. And the reason why is just straight up because of what we saw. Oh, also there's one more thing. Those are not swamps. Yeah, all of these mana in the deck are all not swamps, and so those Nightmares were not nearly as good. But the Singer Vampires actually remained pretty good. But then the next thing I want to get in is I saw that I needed more turn 1 plays, and so I needed to get those Stone Throwing Devils in to either be a turn 1 play or to be something else that I could cast to back up a Dark Ritual. But now the question becomes, what do you take out? So, let's see, let's flip through the deck here and see some things that we think might have been able to be removed. That's a tough question. So, this is where I'd probably lay out the whole deck. In fact, you know what? I'm going to pause, lay out the deck, and then look at these Stone Throwing Devils. Okay, deck's all laid out. Now, before I jump back in, I know there's glare issues right now, guys. I'm sorry about that. I'll try to work on how the lighting is. It's really hard to set this up and not have actual lighting issues. Anyways, so I've got 3 Black Knights, 4 Spectres, 2 Vampires, 2 Sorceress Queens, 2 Urgrators, 2 Order of the Ebon Hand, 3 Disenchants, 2 Armageddons, a Balance, Demonic Tutor, Mind Twist, Chaos Orb, 4 Hymns, 4 Swords to Plowshares, and 2 Nevinrall's Discs. And what I want to try to fit in is these 4 Stone Throwing Devils. And so after goldfishing a bunch, what we noticed is there isn't a lot of these early aggressive creatures, is kind of what the design of the deck actually was. So I'm going to first say these Sorceress Queens were put in there initially to try to combo with the early Knights and make the early Knights really threatening. But the Sorceress Queens, they weren't quite hitting that, right? Because the Sorceress Queens aren't nearly as good if you don't have that 2 damage creature out there on the actual board. So at the moment, I'm going to pull those 2 Sorceress Queens out. And There is 2 Nevinyrral's discs in the deck, and that deals with many of the same things that the Plows and the Disenchants do. And 2 Disenchants is an awful lot to go. 3 Disenchants is an awful lot main deck when you have 2 discs and a Chaos Orb as well. So I'm going to pull out one of the Disenchants. And the Armageddon is a really solid strategy, but it only happens late game, only every once in a while. Drawing multiple Geddons can be kind of terrible, and I can Demonic Tutor for it. So at the moment, I'm going to focus on the main strategy of the deck and pull back from all the fancy, cool things a little bit. So I have one Armageddon, but I also have that Demonic Tutor, so I can go get the Armageddon if I want to. Now that opens up the room for the 4 Stone Throwing Devils to actually put those guys in. And we already made that Nightmare replacement. So there we go. We've actually gone through some solo play. We've done a little bit of focusing on the deck. We don't want to make too many changes at this stage. So the final thing that we're going to go through is the solo play. And now I'll show you guys what solo play actually is. Okay, here we are. We're back, guys. Now, this is what I set up for solo play. As you can see, I literally have 2 decks here, and I have all the life counters for them, the dark blues being 5, the light blues being 1. So both decks are starting with 20 life. And this is one of my budget decks. This is the green deck. As you can see, like all the Urnams and Elves and Berserks and stuff. And this is the mid-range black-white deck that I've been working on. And what I do for solo play is I literally play both sides of both decks. And what I'm going for is to get insight about the interactions, as how the gears mesh of these 2 decks. You can't really get insight about how this player might bluff this player, or this player might bluff this one. To some extent, I mean, you can get kind of some idea, but not completely. But what you can get when you're doing solo play is you can see about the interaction of the 2 decks. You can see almost like, you know, the gears of a machine, how they actually mesh and how they turn. And you can, in fact, get a lot of insight about it. So when I do this, you know, I'll go ahead and I'll be, you know, to somewhat random. There's a 1 for that deck and a 1 for this deck. That's funny. A 20 for this deck and a 12 for this deck. So this one's going to go first, and then you kind of look at how your starting hand is going to be. That's acceptable. This guy's starting hand, I don't know if you can see. That's acceptable. Yeah, pretty decent for both of them. Okay, so the green deck was going to go first, and the green would probably, with this setup, probably play a forest and a birds. And then this deck would probably start with, that's an easy call, so that'd be a swamp, a dark ritual, stone throwing, and ergs. Nice fast bust out. Then this deck would go again. Probably it would play Mishras. Tap the Mishras for a soul ring. Tap the soul ring. Let's see, and a forest for a Satanal Druid. And then probably say turn with that, because no reason to swing with the birds. Then this deck would go again. Draw. Play a land. And against, I got a 2-3 and a 1-1 first striker. Definitely want to swing into both of those guys. So I'll attack into both of those. And the plow could deal with either one of those guys. The disenchant will slow down the actual ramp. So what we could do is we could actually disenchant that soul ring to slow down the ramp. Maybe that's not a bad call. So let's try that. Disenchant. And this guy, of course, didn't block, so he took 3. Then you pass turn here. This guy starts, he untaps, draws. Okay, so what do we got here? So we're probably going to tap that for a Llanowar Elf. And we're probably going to activate Factory and swing for 3 back the other direction. Like that. Then pass turn. Draw. Play a land. Okay, and in this case it would be swing again for 3 more. And probably just keep that plow ready for something else, then pass turn. He would untap. And this would probably be a swing into it, but we'd be holding this berserk. Let's see, this is 17 life. So this could become 4 then 8. That's not enough for any kind of decent damage. So it'd probably be activate factory. Swing with both of these guys in that. In which case the black deck would probably plow. Get him removed. Gain 2 life. Then take 2 from those 2 guys. And then this guy would probably be done, so he'd probably pass the turn. So black deck would untap. So you can see kind of what I'm doing here. Play that. Oh, this would be good. Swing with all these and take 3 life off. Then tap 4 for Nevinral's disc. And that actually would, of course, make the druid get a little bit bigger. And this guy would start his turn again. Untap. Draw. Play land. He could swing for 3. See, what this deck really needs now is like a giant growth or something like that. He could get for 8 and then 1, 9. That wouldn't be good enough. So he'd probably just hold these on into your hand. Swing for as much damage as you can get. And then probably pass the turn. You guys can kind of see how this actually goes, right? Now, the reason why I'm doing all this is, like I was saying, you get to see how the decks interact. Now, I'm, of course, not necessarily making the best decisions on either side. I can't really bluff, but what I can do is I can see the meshing of the 2 decks. I call this solo play, and I think it's more informational than one might assume. It yields a lot more results than one might actually assume. And I do the full thing when I go through this. Like, I shuffle the decks, I sideboard, I try to like make changes, I rotate out the opposing deck that I'm going against, so the main deck I'm playing, I can kind of see how they interact. And I try to play through a bunch of actual games so I can see the interactions. Now, one of the big advantages of doing solo play is you get to see how your deck competes with something else that's in the meta, but you're doing it without basically revealing your deck to anyone. So everything you're doing kind of stays secretive, right? So if you show up to that tournament, you haven't been kind of letting the cat out of the bag. That's really nice. Also, as you saw how fast I could actually get through some turns, if you have a decent variety of other decks built, even if they're all just proxies, like you say the main 3 decks in a format, you can build something and then you can solo play 2 decks against each other, and you can make a lot of refinements like right there, right? So, I mean, that's equivalent, I'd say, to going to several different weekends of tournaments, because you only get so many games against people, right? Because there's all the time delays and such. And you saw how fast I could actually take the turns back and forth. If I solo play and just try to make quick decisions for like, you know, a couple hours, that might be like a whole, you know, weekend worth of tournaments if I can play quick enough, because I kind of know how the decks interact and I can kind of think through those turns really fast. And again, remember, the focus is getting more insight on your deck against other ones, but kind of as the game is actually progressing. This is kind of like a next step up of goldfishing. So yeah, there you go. I call it solo play, and I hope it's useful to you guys. So there you guys go. That's goldfishing, and that's doing what I call focus and solo play. And these guys, these pieces are all just tools in the toolbox of somebody who's actually brewing their own decks. And of course, like many people will say, nothing compares to playing against other people, and there's absolute truth to that. But there's advantages to these things that I just did. The goldfishing can happen like as soon as you build a deck. You start, shuffle it, draw it out, play that goldfishing, you fix some mana curve issues and stuff right off the bat. And then when you start doing the solo play, you start to get insight on how the combos of your deck works, how the deck kind of unfolds, and you get to actually like do a little bit more like quick, it's basically like quick interval is the real focus of solo play. Because you're doing it in your own home, you got all your cards right there, and you're just blowing through those games as fast as you can and just getting lots of information and seeing how they all react. And what you're trying to do is, like if you're trying to like, you know, refine something amazing, you want to cut off the big chunks first. Like if you're carving a statue, you know, you chop off the big chunks first. And then at some point, you've got your statue all carved out, you know, you're Michelangelo and you're working on your David, and now you just got like little bumps on the marble surface, and now you're sanding it down just that little bit. You want that sanding to be more of your actual tournament play and seeing like meta game how you go against a diverse number of decks, right? You don't want that to happen like at your very beginning. You want to just like be going through big chunks initially. And so those quick revisions, getting that insight, getting that breadth of knowledge is really important. Something else to say, a big mistake that people make constantly when they're brewing a new deck is they'll have somebody or some deck archetype, or archetype, however you say it, that they really want to beat. And they'll get so focused on that people will kind of lose the goal of that, the fact that their deck is supposed to go against the entire meta, or maybe what the strategy of their deck does, and people oftentimes will alter their deck too much to go against that one archetype of deck, or that one specific build, right? Now, as I was saying with the solo play, I go through lots of different decks, and I try to take these quick games, right? And I don't want to be too focused on any one deck. I want to see how does my deck interact with like lots of different archetypes, you know, a land destruction and a control and an aggro creature deck and a burn deck and stuff like that. Spread it out, get a wealth of information, right? And you get your deck general first, and then once you know kind of like if your meta is very closed, like everybody plays blue, everybody plays something, that's when you kind of want to narrow down, but you want to know what the soul of your deck really is. And it's that quick revolution of the solo play and the goldfishing that I think really gets you there. And then for that last stage, what I like to refer to as kind of like the long-term deck refinement cycle. I'm going to get to that on video 3, but until that one's ready, stay awesome, you guys, and I hope you come back, and I hope this has been really helpful for you. Bye.